Podcasting, the latest frontier. These are the episodes of a Catch as Catch Can podcast. Its continuing mission: to explore strange, nerdy topics, to chat about sports, movies, sci-fi, and so much more. To boldly pod where this nerd has gone before. Captain's log, pod date 0812.19. On this episode of Too Boldly Pod, right off the get-go, we're going to have a discussion about the new Doctor of the Doctor Who series, Jodie Whittaker. Then after that, we will answer this week's Too Boldly Pod question, which is name 5 things that start with your first letter of your first name that you would get at the grocery store. In about 10 minutes from now, we'll have part 2 of my discussion with my buddy Dave about classic wrestling champions. After that will be a little segment that I've deemed Overreaction Theatre, which centers around a preseason football game. And after that, we will take a look at what's in the news. So, Scotty, set phasers on stun. Engage. Now, this week I was going to continue my Doctor Who conversation by talking about finishing up the 6th Doctor's tenure and discussing that, but I'm not quite done with it yet, so I think I'll wait until the next podcast to do that. But I'm still going to have a little bit of a quick little Doctor Who conversation. It's sort of a rant, if you will, because it doesn't matter if you're a Doctor Who fan. I'm curious to talk to somebody out there that doesn't really like our current Doctor that we have, Jodie Whittaker, and there seems to be a lot of strife and dislike about her and the series now that she is the current Doctor. And the reason I bring that up is because there was another rumor / article that her and the showrunner Chris Chibnall have walked away from the program, and this has been proven to be quote-unquote fake news or false yet again. They haven't left. They're not planning on leaving. They're having a blast doing the program. So I'm just curious why the anger and angst towards Jodie Whittaker as the character of the Doctor. Is it just because she's female? Do you just hate her that much because she's a female? Or is it you don't like how the stories have evolved? Because to be quite frank, I wouldn't say it's been my favorite season of Doctor Who this past year with her on it, but I enjoyed them and I liked them very, very much. And I thought as the year went on, they grew into the roles very, very well. So I've been extremely satisfied with what they've done with Doctor Who, and I'm really looking forward to 2020 when the new season finally kicks off. So maybe you can just, if you are one of those people that don't like her as the Doctor, maybe you'd be willing to come on here on a later podcast and sit down and have a civil conversation and explain to me why there's so much vitriol towards Jodie Whittaker as the Doctor. So if you are, let me know, or if you just have some thoughts about it, let me know on Facebook or Twitter at Too Boldly Pod. Now, this week's Too Boldly Pod question is a little bit different. It was something that I saw that I wasn't quite sure how many people were going to respond to it. I thought it might have been a little too thought-provoking, a little too in-depth, people wouldn't be interested in doing it. And I was proven seriously wrong because of all the questions we've asked in the past on this podcast. This is by far the most responses I got. So put one in the loss column for Dan not knowing what the hell to think. But anyways, the question, and it's a fun little question. Question is, you need 5 items from the grocery store that start with the first letter of your name. What are you buying? And as I stated, we got a ton of responses to this. So thank you to everyone that replied. Marty replied, mangoes, mandarins, melons, mushrooms, and mascarpone. Sarah replied, spaghetti, sushi, soup, soap, and squash. Jeff replied, jelly, juice, jello, Jerry curl, and Joy dish soap. Thomas replied, tomatoes, tapatio, taco meat, tortillas, and tri-tip. TJ replied, taco seasoning, taco shells, taco meat, Tabasco, and tab. And I replied to him, all right, dude, you had me. And then you kicked me in the balls by saying tab. Marie replied, meat, marinade, mushrooms, meringue, and milkshake. Debbie replied, Doritos, dill pickles, donuts, dressing, and dinner. Kate replied, minute rice, milk, mozzarella, mayo, and mac and cheese. And then I replied, Kate, you're going to screw everybody up. Kate's her middle name, but she goes by Kate. So take that, Mary. Angela replied, asparagus, Asiago cheese, albacore tuna, acorn squash, and ACI fruit. Or if I'm pronouncing that right, I don't know. Sherry replied, spaghetti sausage, strawberries, streusel cake, and stewed tomatoes. Kayla replied, mine is hard, but Klondike bars, Kit Kat, kebabs, Kellogg cereal, and kosher pickles. Craig replied, crab legs, chocolate cake or cookies, cereal, clam or corn chowder, and chicken. Carol replied, cake, cookies, carrots, cinnamon, cunum. Beth replied, beer, burger, bathroom tissue, brownies, and beer, to which I gave her the thumbs up for mentioning beer twice. Jim replied, Jolt Cola, Jelly Baby jelly beans, Jägermeister, jalapenos, and Gysema, which I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that correct. Andy replied, Aggies, antelope, Asante, Asiago, and apples. Scott replied, shrimp, shells, and cheese, sheet cake, which he wrote shit cake, made me laugh, salmon, and sake. Marlene replied, milk, maple syrup, mozzarella cheese, mango juice, and maple donuts. And maple donuts. Oh. Jenny replied, jet dry juice boxes, junior mints, jujubes, and Gysema. Lori replied, lettuce, lobsters, leeks, lemons, and lentils. Tim replied, toilet paper, taffy, tea, tenderloins, and Tic Tacs. Tracy replied, tomatoes, turkey, tangerines, Twinkies, and tortilla chips. Dawn replied, devil's food cake, dark chocolate, dragon fruit, Dijon mustard, and duck. Pat replied, pasta, peanuts, pizza, papaya, and peaches. Chris replied, cheese, Cool Whip, cherries, cantaloupe, and carrots. Patrick replied, potatoes, pasta, Pepsi, pork ribs, and Pop-Tarts. Good dinner right there. Rob replied, Reese's Pieces, Ruffles potato chips, rum, rice, and raisins. Larry replied, lettuce, liquor, lava soap, lollipops, and Lawry's seasoned salt. Andy replied, alcohol, apples, avocados, applesauce, and A&W root beer. Mike replied, milk, mayonnaise, mustard, meat, and Mountain Dew. And Gaynell replied, grapes, granola bars, Gouda cheese, gummy bears, and Glad trash bags. So thank you all for your answers. That was a fun little Too Boldly Pod question that I was really surprised I got that many questions or replies to. And on a side note, I asked my mother, her name is Martha, and she listed 4 off, and she's sitting there kind of thinking hard about the 4th one, and I'm like, marzipan? And she looks at me, she's like, how do you know what marzipan is? I don't know, I watch TV, Mom. Anyways, thank you all for answering this week's question. It was a fun one. If you didn't answer and you want to, let me know on Facebook or Twitter at Too Boldly Pod. And last week, I was joined by my buddy Dave as we were discussing the legends of champions, the old school legends of wrestling. And we're going to have part 2 of it this week on To Boldly Pod. Now, we concluded or cut off the conversation last week, and we were talking about the legends as they were on the mic. So, Dave, take it away.
Well, speaking of mic work, the guy that we just recently lost just a few days ago, Harley, I've always said Harley's very underrated on the mic. You listen to his interviews, and that voice of his, he just, and they say that Harley was legit to begin with, but he just makes it sound like he's going to go in there and just whip somebody.
Well, one thing I liked about Harley, and you can even transfer this into the 80s, is in that era of the 80s where they all sat there and screamed their shoot, but he always used, it's kind of like what shit. Oh, well, I just swear on the air, son of a... what Jake did is
we've got standards on this program.
Yeah,
plenty. To do that, okay?
He did exactly, or well, I should say Jake did the same thing that he did. He didn't yell and scream his bits. He just used, his voice.
Yep.
And I always loved that. I mean, I love Nature Boy and his cuts, his promos, how he got worked up, but there was something, honest and genuine about Harley and people like Jake that didn't sit there and scream everything, tried to Shatner their promo.
I actually saw something on Twitter. They were asking questions about if they did a remake of Silence of the Lambs, or if they did a movie in the 80s of Silence of the Lambs movie, and they used wrestlers instead, who would be a good Hannibal, and who would make a good Buffalo. You know what I'm saying?
Buffalo Bill.
Yeah, Buffalo Bill. Who would make a good Buffalo Bill? And so a lot of people were saying Jake would make a good Hannibal, but I actually said that Jake would make a better Buffalo Bill.
I agree with that.
I think it would be really creepy. And I said Kevin Sullivan would be Hannibal.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So yeah, we're kind of getting off topic here, but so do you have any other thoughts about these old school wrestlers, old school champions?
What I was going to ask you is, what do you think today's wrestling would be? I mean, take away aside that it wasn't a business back then, but what do you think that generation gave to this current generation? I mean, other than the business itself, do you think these current wrestlers take anything from any of those old school guys?
Well, I think more than what we know, more than what we can see. We were talking about Jack Briscoe because he was a world champion, but not necessarily. But his brother Jerry was backstage for a lot of years there in the WWE, and he helped a lot of guys out, from my understanding, of what to do in and out of the ring, and some of the other guys kind of disappeared from the scene, but I think some of the guys like Vader got to work with Harley when Harley was in WCW in the early '90s. I think that was kind of a buffer there, but those guys got the old school stuff, and so this generation who got to be with the Scott Halls, the Chris Jerichos, they might not have worked direct. This newer generation might not have worked directly with Harley, with Briscoes and whatnot, but they still got some of the knowledge through the prior generation, if that makes any sense at all.
Sort of a pay it forward thing.
Yeah. We're talking about world, so we can't, but Patterson was backstage a lot. We know, well,
yeah,
whatever. But yeah, Slaughter was back there a lot of years. Even we know him as a jobber, but Tony Gurria was back there,
right?
So, and WCW. I'm trying to think of the guys that were. Kevin Sullivan was backstage until WCW died. We make fun of him, but Mike Graham was back there, Eddie Graham's son.
Right.
Mike Graham was 160 pounds. He, nobody could really take him seriously except himself. But, he was Eddie Graham's son, and he worked behind the scenes with his dad. And if you know anything about wrestling, at one time that Florida territory was on fire down there, and that was Eddie Graham. He's the one that made the American dream,
right?
In the 70s. So,
well, here's one for the 70s and even into the 80s. But he wasn't a world champ, but he needs to be included, I think. And it's the only reason he wasn't a world champ probably is because people couldn't put it on him, when that's Andre. Does he fit into the criteria?
Yeah, the stories I've heard about Andre was he treated it as a business. And I don't want to say a bully, but I think a lot of people learn respect from Andre on the way he conducted his business.
Right.
Unless you're Brock Lesnar, Brock Lesnar could probably maybe body slam Big Show if Big Show didn't want to be slammed,
right?
Lesnar, but Harley Race slammed Andre, Stan Hansen slammed, but it's a lot easier to body slam somebody that size if you have cooperation,
right?
Andre could have could have ran through the 70s and 80s, and he could have went in business for himself and put every dang belt he wanted, on his own waist. He could have grabbed hold of Superstar Graham if he wanted that belt and just said that, fine, and just took it from him, in the middle of Madison Square Garden. So, it's what you need in wrestling is cooperation to make it look real.
Well, one thing with Andre that people that really only know the 80s wrestling is if you go back and watch his 70s stuff, he was a lot better or talented worker back when his body was still cooperating with him. He was doing drop kicks and all kinds of stuff back then. And opposed to the 80s when we just basically seen the falling apart Andre, and it was choke, punch, chop Andre.
Yeah, the lumbering Andre. I've said this to you before. I think Big Show, whether it was better training, I think overall Big Show was always a better athlete than Andre. But you are correct. If you watch Andre's stuff, especially in Japan, he's wrestling. He's wrestling Inoki and Baba. It's not just punch. And I sent you this one footage one time of him and Dusty working against each other, and Big Dust. I mean, if you know Dusty Rhodes, he didn't have Rick Rude's body, put it that way. And Dusty does a flying head scissors on Andre, and Andre sells that and takes a bump completely out of the ring. They both, and it looked like lucha libre. A 500-pound man and a 350-pound man. So.
And the ring shifted 4 inches.
At least. They were hanging from the rafters.
Well, there's another one. He never really had a big belt or a big long run with a belt. Would be Gorilla.
Yeah, Gorilla. Gorilla is one of those guys that I don't think anybody knew, unless you were way on the inside. You didn't realize just how important Gorilla was, because he was one of Vince's Senior's right hand men, even in the 70s, and he was very important to Vince Jr. in the expansion. He owned part of the Puerto Rico territory with Colón down there, and I'd have to go. I told you the numbers and whatnot, but he owned part of the. Whatever it was, the transition from Vince Sr. to Vince Jr., he owned part of what Vince Sr. had.
Right.
And part of the agreement was Vince Jr. bought him out, plus gave him X amount of whatever each year and whatnot. And I don't think anybody realizes until years later just how friggin' how much clout and how much money Gorilla had. Because people just saw him as a broadcaster, but he was he probably helped Vince Jr. in the in the wrestling aspect of things, not just the showbiz.
Oh, will you stop?
So I don't know. Do you have any other thoughts?
That's the last one that came up while you were rattling off your statistics, but I can always think of more.
I came across some weird story this morning because we're talking about newer wrestlers. I guess John Cena. Everybody knows John Cena, right?
Yeah, he was the guy that was the Marine.
Yeah, he's Super Cena. He talk about no selling anything. Anyways, I guess he was in an accident last night.
Really?
Outside the arena. He was coming out of the arena, and some guy hit him. The guy was in a car and hit him. There were thoughts that the guy was going to be charged with reckless driving or anything, but the police said that there's no way that they can do that because it was John Cena and the driver couldn't see him.
There we go. I'll be here all week. Honestly, with Cena, you know what my favorite Cena gimmick of all time was?
Rapping Cena?
Yeah, it was that. Yeah. That Cena was always my favorite John Cena character.
Yeah, when I remember I took a break from watching and I caught it and I turned it back on, and whether it was some people didn't like it, whatever. When he would, I would pop on it. It would make me crack up when he pumped up his shoes. When he was getting ready to come off the top rope or whatever, he would pump up his shoes. I just that made me pop every time. I don't know why. So
way better than You Can't See Me, Cena, but that's just me.
What about his arch nemesis rapping Kurt Angle?
See, I totally forgot about that till you just said it.
If you get on YouTube and find rapping Kurt Angle had some mad skills that you wouldn't necessarily believe would show up. But yeah, he buried Cena a few times in a rap battle. So so you think you have any more thoughts about anything?
No, you go ahead.
Okay. Well, it's my understanding. It's my understanding that because you're my guest here on Dynamite Dave's podcast. It's my understanding that you have some sort of podcast or something, and I was, if you wanted to tell people how you could be listened to.
Yeah, I'm working on one.
Okay. And where do you find that at?
It's called the Internet, and you can find...
Do they have that on computers now?
Yes, they do.
Okay. So, well...
But you can listen to the podcast anywhere that people listen to their favorite podcast, whether it be iTunes or Stitcher or Transistor or anywhere.
Well, some of that stuff sounds, familiar. I don't always know. I got the #1 rated podcast in my house here, and I can't always know all the small details and whatnot. I'll ask my assistants if I'm assuming we're probably not on the same services.
I hope you pay your assistants better than I pay my assistants. So
yeah, and I'm sure your podcast you can probably find on the B shows, right? On the B show.
right.
services and whatnot. Okay.
It's all on the dark net.
Do you have is there a name to it or anything?
Yeah, it's called Dan is Really Trying Podcast.
Okay. Dad, say that again.
It's Dave is really trying. Oh, I mean it.
You say Dan is really trying?
Yes.
Can you say that again so my listeners can hear it?
Dan is. See, you got me cracking up already. Dan is Really Trying Podcast.
Okay. Okay. Well,
it's nice that you got a sound effect machine, though.
Well, I would like to thank you for taking some of your time out of your not your busy schedule but out of your schedule to be my special guest this week on my podcast, my #1 rated podcast, and I think we'll wrap it up, and this is your host, Dynamite Dave's podcast.
It's me, it's DDP.
Okay.
Nicely done, Dale.
Okay, thanks, Stan.
Yeah, no problem. Welcome to a segment I'm going to call Overreaction Theatre. And this is going to be more locally centric than some of you may know or like, but maybe you can relate a little bit with the teams that you root for and whatnot. And I know I'm going to sound very Lion-esque when I say this, but a lot of people, most people that are sports fans don't feel or have experienced the pain that us Detroit Lions fans have suffered through over the past 60 years. Not even want to hear the people that are Cubs fans talk, because whatever. Anyways, you guys won. But here we go. Overreaction Theater. This past Thursday was the first preseason game for the Detroit Lions. And I think it's pretty safe to say that they came out and laid an absolute egg in that game. They got their proverbial ass handed to them by the New England Patriots. Now, you might be thinking that, well, the Patriots are the Super Bowl champs and the Lions suck, so why wouldn't they? But you know what? Let's start at the beginning with this. Going into this preseason and season in general, everybody was sort of looking at all the changes the Lions have made and renewed a little bit, not everybody, but some of us renewed a little bit of hope of what we may see with the Detroit Lions this year. And you know what? We still may, because unlike everybody else, I'm not overreacting to the butt kicking that they took this past Monday, and the lion's share of the, well, how do you want to word that? The lion's share of the angst from fans came from the fact that their offensive line looked pathetic. Well, you know what? It wasn't really the offensive line. I mean, the starting offensive line, or the projected starting offensive line, only played, I believe, the first series, and they didn't look all that bad in that series. But when the backups got in the game, they look putrid. They look like a bunch of high school students trying to play against a professional football team. They couldn't block anybody. They couldn't do anything. And I understand people's points about these being backups, and it's football. Somebody's gonna get hurt along the line, and one of these guys is gonna have to step in and do the job. And honestly, it didn't look like any of them could do the job. So maybe all of them will be working at Wendy's come the start of the NFL season. I don't know, but they did look wretched. They did look horrible. They got one of the backup quarterbacks damn near killed. And yeah, so little bit of an overreaction, I believe, by fans because it was the first preseason game and you walked in expecting that hype. But let me just close this all with saying, you can react like that after, say, the third preseason game, or dare I say the first regular season game. Then you can have a little bit of an overreaction to what we saw this past Thursday, if they look like that when the games actually count. So I'm not going to overreact and call this another 0-16 season quite yet. Did they look unprepared? Did they look uninspired? Did they look like they didn't want to play? Yeah, they did. And if you take some quote-unquote experts, in Chris Spielman, who was calling the game from the booth, he made a lot of references to people not being ready, and Spielman tends to be a greener side of the grass type of announcer. He'll point out mistakes, but he tends to look more at the positive. And then the following day on terrestrial sports talk radio, former player John Jansen was really pissed off about their performance. He said guys just looked like they didn't even want to play. And was that a little overreaction? I can't say because I don't know John Jansen. I've never been in his shoes. I've never played the game at that level, so I can't really say. But as a fan, I can say, you know what, I was very, very, very disappointed, but I'm not going to overreact and wash this entire season after one preseason game. Now, later on down the road, I may come back on this podcast and rail about it, but it is what it is. It was one preseason game. Most of the starters didn't even play. And I think it's time. Maybe it was a good wake-up call for them. Maybe they will come back and look much better after that. I don't know. If you have any thoughts about it, if you're a Lions fan and you have any thoughts about it, let me know on Facebook or Twitter at TooBoldlyPod. And in the news this week, and it comes courtesy of the BBC via my buddy Dave, whom you heard earlier, and the headline is, Kenya's Homo Bay fart pushes speaker to suspend debate. A heated debate about market stalls when disrupted by a foul smell and furious finger-pointing at a Kenyan regional assembly on Wednesday, a local report states. Honorable Speaker, one of us has polluted the air, and I know who it is, Julius Gaia reportedly told Homo Bay County Assembly. But the member he accused of farting is said to have replied, I am not the one. I cannot do such a thing in front of my colleagues. Hoping to clear the air, the Assembly Speaker, Edwin Karshich, then instructed members to step outside and take a break from the chamber. Reports also state that he asked officials to bring in air fresheners to make it pleasant. Get whatever flavor you can find in any office, whether it be vanilla or strawberry. We cannot continue sitting in an environment that smells this bad. Yet the smell is said to have subsided or dissipated long before any such sprays were found, allowing the debate to continue. So it's nice to see that other countries other than this one have trivial little arguments in their governmental assemblies. And all I can say to that is, the hell is wrong with mankind? And that's going to wrap up this episode of Too Boldly Pod. I hope you enjoyed the program. There won't be a new podcast for a couple of weeks because in a few days I am leaving to go to northern Michigan to escape society and get away from everything for a week and recharge my proverbial batteries. So thank you all for listening. As usual, I don't have a closer to this show, and since I'm going camping, I'll just say, hand me a marshmallow and row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Talk to all of you next time. Trek fans will get it.
WLLP Spock Rock Radio.